Hello.
So good to see everyone.
Thanks everybody for joining. You can sit anywhere.
Welcome to everybody that's coming in online. Good to see some familiar faces here. Hard to believe we're already in April, but we are. So happy April, everybody. Welcome. We'll get started in just a minute or so. Lots of folks are filing in. Good to see everyone. Good to see you on here, Annie. I haven't gotten to bump into you in a while. And just a note for the team in there, it sounds like there is a bit of an echo. I don't know if that's avoidable, but
Oh, I don't know. Can you guys turn your mics off?
hey, Stacy, good to see you.
Hi there. How you doing?
Good.
Happy to be here.
Yeah. All right, everybody, just hey, Jeanette, my fellow Mercedian. Love it. All right, everybody, give folks just maybe another 30 seconds to file in here. We've got pretty big group this time, both in person and online, so that's kind of cool. I just got back from the East Coast, but I heard it rained. Was it stormy?
We got a good amount of thunder here yesterday.
Ah, that's cool. That's cool.
All
Okay,
right, very good. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, should we go ahead and get started? All right, let's do it. Well, thanks again, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Good afternoon. I'm Isaiah Anderson, an Associate Regional Planner here at SJCOG. Thanks to everyone again for joining us today. We have a great event.
Welcome, everyone.
Oh, sorry. Can you guys
Eric,
hear me?
can you hear us?
And Yolanda Meraz.
He's
We
muted.
can't hear him.
Sorry, Eric, are you there?
Yeah, sorry about that. You can hear me
No
now?
worries.
Yes, can you hear
Okay,
us?
great. Yes, I think we've
Okay.
all got it figured out now.
Okay.
All right, everybody, welcome. My name is Eric Sarato. I am the director of North Valley Thrive. North Valley Thrive, as you know, is a regional organization that is
Eric?
here representing Merced. Yes.
I'm going to pause you so we can let Isaiah introduce the room first, and then I'm going to hand it over to you if that's all right.
Sure.
Cool.
Sure, that's great.
Sorry about
us
that
here
mix-up.
know what's going on.
Thanks, Thomas.
Cool.
All right. So we're here today with the Speaker Series event hosted by SJCOG. We're here in downtown Stockton, of course, in partnership with the University of the Pacific Business Center for Business and Policy Research, as well as the North Valley Thrive team. So thanks to everybody. We're excited to share some highlights from the recently completed San Joaquin County Demographic and Employment Forecast. We have, of course, this forecast is an essential component of our Regional Transportation Plan and Sustainable Communities Strategy, RTP. This event also marks more than 15 years of collaboration between SJCOG and CBPR. Over that time, our partnership has helped create data-driven planning, informed regional decision-making, and brought clarity to the trends shaping our communities. So we're thrilled to welcome our panel of state-level experts today. Especially want to thank Dr. Thomas Pogue for his leadership and insight. And we hope this session sparks meaningful dialogue and provides useful context as we look forward to the future of San Joaquin County. So I'll pass it off to you, Eric.
Yeah, thanks then. Thank you so much for that. Yes, those of you that have been participating in these webinars know a little bit about North Valley Thrive, but if you recall, in a nutshell, the state organized itself a couple years ago into 13 economic development regions, and we are one of those regions. And the idea was to support each region in the state to develop its own vision of economic prosperity, a vision that really centered folks that have been marginalized or out of the decision-making process. And so this has certainly been an economic development project, but one that is really community-centered. And we've been at this for a couple years now, and we developed a strategic report. But in addition to that, we've been doing a whole set of other things. We've been looking at our economy from a variety of different perspectives. And I think the last conversation we had was a really kind of riveting conversation on the history of our region from an economic lens. And this conversation is a really cool kind of juxtaposition to that. And it's looking into the future. I know you know Dr. Pogue really well. He is just phenomenally talented and has really been the pillar for all of our work. And we are incredibly grateful to UOP for their leadership and their coordination across our region, working with other institutions to develop a really clear vision of where we've been and where we're going. Today is about forecasting growth and change, and we'll be joined by Dr. Pogue, but we're also going to be joined by Somjita Mitra and Walter Schwarm, who are going to give us a really interesting perspective on where we're going. And with that, I will toss it over to my friend, Dr. Thomas Pogue.
Thanks so much, Eric, and thanks everybody for being with us today. Excited to see this hybrid situation, a little bit nervous, but I think all the technology is working, but please give us a shout if there's any issues as we go along here. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Hopefully I will get that right. And yes, it looks like it's showing up there. What we wanted to do today was give a little bit of context and introduction from the North San Joaquin Valley perspective, but I've been talking a lot at the speaker series and through the series that we've had with North Valley Thrive about what's been happening at the regional level, but we're not alone in what's happening here at the region. And I was so grateful that colleagues from the Department of Finance were able to join us to participate in this conversation today. So after I set a little bit of framing at the regional level, they're going to walk us through the broader perspective, at least at the state level, of what some of these trends that we're seeing here mean in the context of the state. So 75 years of growth in one slide. We will be having these all posted online and sent out to you that are registered online, but also they'll be posted on the SJCOG website, as well as on the North Valley Thrive website. This, however, is showing, related back to our last webinar at North Valley Thrive, talking about the history of the region, some of those dynamics that we've seen over time, where our region over there on the lower left-hand side was in the 50s and 60s a little bit slower than the state in terms of our population growth rates, lagging behind a little bit, and then moving up with the state in the 70s and 80s. And if we remember back to our conversation with the history team that Philip Merlot was talking to us last time, that correspond to some of the Southeast Asian migration correspondence and changes that we were seeing in terms of the broader integration and mega region growth in the area. And the 80s in particular are a very sharp rate of growth here on this, where the state, where the region was growing relatively strong to the state. And then in the 90s, we had a little bit of a slower growth, not only statewide, but in the region, moving out of the boom of the 80s and slowing. And then in the 2000s, we also took off. In this period, particularly for the North San Joaquin Valley region, we were growing about 1% higher than the state on an annual basis, which doesn't maybe sound like a lot, but it is a lot in terms of population growth rates. And then looking at the 2010s, maintaining that growth, although slowing a little bit and suffering as we were coming out of the housing crisis and some of the challenges that the housing crisis impacted on our region, where we were known as ground zero from the housing crisis, slowing that down, but then picking up in the latter part of the 2010s. And then of course came the pandemic. And the pandemic is the last little bit there on the side that you see where things have flattened out. And looking coming out of the pandemic, as we look forward, there's a lot of change coming. And this next slide looks at what our 25-year forecast for the region says. And I should acknowledge this forecast is the regional forecast. We've leveraged the work that we've done in partnership with SJCOG, also StanCOG, and North Valley Thrive to put together this regional forecast to really contextualize what's happening across the counties. So I don't have a lot of detail. I have one slide talking about some county-specific differences, but the important part here is this change that we're seeing in terms of the growth rates. And the orange, hopefully you can see it as orange on your screens. The orange data on the left is the population in the last 25 years, using the state population estimates for what our region's population was. And then we took a linear trend line from that, and that's the dotted line that you see there. And then on the right is what we're looking at in our 25-year forecast, looking out to 2050. What are we seeing in terms of the population growth? And the dotted line there is the trend line. And you see the slopes of those trend lines are very different. And that's where the past 25 years, we were averaging 1.2% growth per year. We're looking at growth at 0.5% over the next 25 years. And that's important for us to think about as we think about the future and what's happening. But it's not just that the growth is slowing down. We're having sort of structural changes associated with that growth. And that's what we want to talk about. Well, I want to talk about today in particular. And in particular, focusing on the change in the structure of age of our population. How do we put projections together? Just to give you some context in terms of how we look at this and what drives growth. We look at two main components. The first is who's moving in and who's moving out. That's net migration. And the second is the natural increase. And that's the difference between births and fatalities. And those two components added together give us our future population. But we look back most often to see what's driving those. And so we look at the record looking back. And that's what I want to just walk through in a couple of slides to set the framework in terms of where we have come from, in terms of the components of net migration, which are foreign immigrants, as well as the components of domestic migration, which are inflows from other parts of California, or net inflows from other parts of California, and net inflows from other parts of the US. In the case of the inflows from other parts of California, they are typically positive in our region. In terms of the net flows from other parts of the US, we're typically negative. So we get inflows from the Bay Area, and outflows to the rest of the US has been a characteristic of our region for a long while now, and it continues to be an important structure. As we look at the population at the highest level, looking at those components of net migration and net natural increase, you see a lot of fluctuation in that migration component, where we've seen some changes over time. And this is the last 25 years, looking back at those components of population. But importantly here, I just wanted to point out that our average annual population growth has gone from about 24,000 in the 2000s down to 15,000 in the 2010s. And in the period from 2020 to 2024, we've been averaging about 5,700. So we're slowing down a lot from what we have had in terms of growth historically. As we look at the first part of it, net migration, again, up here in San Joaquin County, in Stanislaus and Merced, we know the connectivity that we have to the Bay Area, the new developments that are going in. We see the traffic's growing. That inflow from the Bay Area has been an important source of our positive net domestic migration. When that inflow slows down, we have, for a variety of reasons, which we're not going to get into today in too much detail, but we can talk about it at the end, those net outflows to other parts of the US typically. And those have been important sources of those places where we're dipping down negatively, like around the housing crisis in 2008 to 2010. You see those negative numbers there in terms of the net domestic migration. Those were related to that housing crisis, as well as during the pandemic, somewhat counterintuitively to what we thought might have happened with remote work and the changes in the Bay Area. The people that were moving out of the Bay Area weren't moving en masse to the North San Joaquin Valley. They were moving further afield to the Texases, Arizonas, Idahos, and those places. And as a result, our net outflows became negative because we weren't getting our historic inflows from the Bay Area. And as we'll see here in a second, our net foreign migration also declined. Oh, it's right here, sorry. In 2001, you see how small that net foreign migration is. There wasn't any in 2020, well, except for the first few months because of all the travel bans. And this is an important and sort of the focus of what I want to set up before handing it off to the colleagues from the Department of Finance, is looking at this change in net natural increase. And hopefully you can see on your screens this gray line, which is the sum of the blue and orange lines. And what's important here is, again, we're seeing a slowdown in this net natural increase. But the births and the slowdown in births that we see here across the top is really an important characteristic and an important influence of what we're seeing as we're looking towards the future and looking at what's happening with our region, which again, for many conversations that we've been having, is kind of changing the identity of what we are, or at least what we have been in some ways, and important to start thinking about the implications of. And that change is driven by a slowdown in the amount of youth, children that are being created. As an economist, we look at supply, and an important function of our population supply is new births. And what's been really dramatic is our slowdown in terms of our fertility rate that we've been seeing. And these figures here are from the Centers for Disease Control. They're actual births divided by population estimates of women aged 15 to 44 years old. We had to put it in thousands because the numbers get into decimal places if you don't. But we've gone in the North San Joaquin Valley from a fertility rate that was 23% above the nation in 2005 to a fertility rate that in 2023, which was the last year we had data for, is just 6% higher than the national rate. And to give this a little bit more context, we again put the trend lines up here. So the North San Joaquin Valley trend line is that dotted green line. The California fertility trend line is the dotted blue line, and the US fertility trend is the dotted orange line. What this is showing is that California and the North San Joaquin Valley are experiencing a pretty similar slowdown, but we're actually going from a place where we had higher birth rates than the US to a place that California is now below the US birth rate. And as these trends are likely to continue, we're looking at the North San Joaquin Valley's birth rate also declining below the national levels. And this is my slide, just to make sure that we're not thinking that we're blaming it on one of our neighbors. It's happening across our region. In Merced County, in Stanislaus County, in San Joaquin County, we're seeing these decreases. And in fact, it's quite stark that Merced County is actually leading us in this decline, where from 2003 to 2023, Merced County has experienced a 31% decrease in its fertility rates. So what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of the implications of the future of our region? Well, it means we're going to get older and we're going to have fewer young population. And this, which is impossible to see for those of you in the boardroom, but hopefully on your screens online you can see it. shows the components in terms of the number of each of the population cohorts and the percentage that they consist of. And I'm going to go into some details of that in just a second. But importantly, at these numbers, you see that the 25 to 64-year-olds are staying relatively stable. That's a big working age population group there. But we're seeing growth in our seniors, and we're seeing this decline in our young adults and children in our region. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second. This slide breaks down the change so you can sort of see on an annual basis where we're gaining or losing population. Post-COVID, we've got a bit of recovery that we're forecasting in the next few years, and then these longer-term trends kick in. And that's where we're seeing their actual declines in the 0 to 14-year-olds and 15 to 24-year-olds over the next couple of decades until some demographics sort of cycle through, and we're seeing a very much smaller growth rate than we have historically. I wanted to share something that at the first North Valley Thrive event we had, which was a population pyramid, and we contrasted that with the Bay Area, where we saw a relatively triangular population pyramid here in the North San Joaquin Valley, and that was in contrast to the Bay Area, where it was much narrower, and actually it was almost like a tree in San Francisco and some of the other areas that we compare to. But my colleague Stephen McCarty pulled this together for us, where we see now our 2025 population pyramid on the left and the change in shape that we're forecasting in terms of looking out at 2049, 25 years from now. We're becoming much more rectangular. And that is again, has a lot of implications, which the colleagues from Department of Finance are going to go into some more details on that. In terms of the numbers, it's striking the components, and we don't have time today to get into the details about the racial and ethnic changes that we are forecast to see. Every group is seeing declines or slowdowns dramatically. Some are bigger than others, but what we are seeing across the board are the decline in youth, where a 10% decline in the population under 25, and a 55% increase in our senior population. A 50,000 decline on that under 25-year-old population, and 130,000 increase in that over 65 population. And importantly, particularly for this region, we have to recognize that that Hispanic senior population is going to be increasing 44% in the next 25 years. And as we think about the demand for businesses, services, as we demand for different amenities, it matters in terms of what our population looks like and what it consists of, as well as when we think about, through our North Valley Thrive process, the needs of different communities. Multilingualism is again important to recognize in this diverse region that we live in, that is just going to become more important and more strategic and an important influence on our planning as we move forward. But we're not alone, and although it's been really stark in terms of the changes that we're looking at, they're also being seen nationally and in the rest of California. Saying that we are changing, and obviously caveating all these things that, we're doing our best to look backwards, to look forwards, and our assumptions can always be proven wrong in terms of the dynamics that are leading these changes. But as we look at what recent history is showing us and what that implies for our future, we're looking much more like the rest of the developed world, the rest of the US and the rest of California in some of these challenges, but we're starting from a different base. And although in 2049, our population 15 to 24-year-old will be like the nation, like the rest of the nation. There are many other parts of the state and parts of the country where that's different. There's many other parts of the world where that's very different, and the older population is distinct in that impact. With that, I'm just going to frame up, handing it over to Walter with a couple of thoughts that have come to our minds in terms of what does this mean as we're thinking about strategies for San Joaquin County, Stanislaus, and Merced in the North Valley Thrive context, but also locally throughout our various organizations, businesses. You know, what does this mean in terms of education and workforce training? What does this mean in terms of changing consumption patterns? Older people usually consume less than younger people. What does it mean in terms of generational equity? You know, we're going to have fewer young people supporting more and more old people. What does that mean in terms of some of our programs and plans, including things like transportation, where we need to get seniors to medical appointments and other things? What does that change in terms of our future needs as a region? And what does that mean in terms of the economics and funding of some of these programs that we have? And with that being said, I am very pleased that we have experts that have decided to join us today. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Walter, to take us through your perspective on some of these changes.
No, thank you. I'm going to wait for Samjita to share the slides, and then I'll get going a bit here. Because that's very interesting, and a nice segue. It really does move quite nice. And you know, all of you are probably thinking it's quite dire for, you know, the Northern San Joaquin Valley, but you know, I'm here to now cast that further and make it even, you know, show the fact that you're actually doing better than the rest of the state. I mean, there's only a few places, you know, these forces, as you know, was pointed out, they kind of work through everything, and you know, they're being felt nationally. They're certainly being felt other places in California, but in reality, you know, the San Joaquin Valley, Northern San Joaquin Valley in particular, it stands to weather them a little bit better than other places, and you see that. I mean, despite some really radical changes that you can see there in the data that was just presented, it's actually not quite that bad for you. Want to do next slide, or you want to get the slideshow up?
Can you see it?
Vegeta?
Can you see it?
I think you need to go to present. If the lower left-hand corner, you can.
Sorry, hold on.
Hey, oh, that's back to you.
Let me try this again. Bear with me. Seem to be having some technical difficulties. Walter, can you share? I'm having a hard time.
Okay, yeah, no problem. I will
My share screen kind of froze right now, sorry.
Okay, no problem. I will go and get well, I'll have to do it this way. Just a second. Zoom is always all right. I will share.
So,
Okay.
I could try it again if it's not working on your side.
It probably will work. Let me go ahead and hit that one, right? All right, is that working for everybody? Do we see the large slide?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, great. Then we're going. Okay, well, good. I'll talk a little bit about demographics and you know, give a broader picture about California and sort of hone in the, like I just mentioned, that you know, in reality as sort of potentially dire as you might consider the things that you just heard, that this is actually, as I point out, you're actually posed for better growth and better outcomes than some of the rest of the states, and certainly some of the rest of the counties in the state. And as you know, was pointed out, and here's California when it really comes right down to it. What we see driving population down during this entire period. I mean, why do we have this sudden decline in the natural increase part? Is really this fact that we have these two things going on. We have reduced fertility in women overall. Are delaying childbirth into their 30s. They're delaying marriage until their late 20s or 30. They're delaying their first child into the early 30s. And they're choosing to have fewer children. Some of that is biological, some of that is sort of cultural, a shift in the desirability of children or desirability of large families. And some of that is just plain economic reality to a certain extent. The net effect, as you look at the yellow stuff here, is births have been declining for a long time, right? I mean, we see that little bump there in the 2000s, 2006, 2007, 2007, but fertility has really been declining since its absolute peak with the echo boom, so the baby boomers having children in 1990. Its rate of decline over the last 10 to 15 years has been, particularly sort of speedy as you look in here. This is, of course, 2020 with COVID. But, if you put a trend line across that, you can see that. But notice this is a change, but we, at least, I mean, in terms of, how I see it or, how my staff is looking at this, and this is also true the way the Census Bureau looks at the national projections, we don't see this fertility decline. We're not Korea. We're not going to come down to 0.7 or 0.6. There is a bottom, and that's part of the reason why some of the stuff that you just saw, we actually see a little bit of increase in the number of 0 to 14, 0 to 5s later on, because there is a bottom. And then with some cohort effects, you do get a little rise in the number of births. The big thing sitting on the back of that one, though, is the baby boomers. You see COVID deaths here in the middle and how we're recovering from that and kind of here back on an original trend that was there previously. But as we go forward, by 2030, all of the baby boomers will be now over 65, but probably most importantly, the very first baby boomers, those born in 1946, they'll be over 75. And as time goes on, many people make it to in their 70s. The number of individuals that make it into their 80s is progressively much lower. And then and even with advances in medical technology and various other things, the baby boomers are just so large that even as things are a little bit better, the number of deaths that they have just really weighs on the entire natural increase series until, at least in our current projection series, we start to have natural decrease in the early 2040s. So that's kind of the larger California picture that's behind some of the numbers that Thomas gave you. I mean, in the sense that this is a factor to a certain extent of the fact that part of the reason why we have so many deaths, actually, I'll go back to that one. One of the reasons why this is really hitting California and to a certain extent the Northern San Joaquin Valley really hard is because we attracted so many baby boomers. When we looked at those growth rates for the region of 3.2, 3.5, 3.8% in the 80s, those are baby boomers. Those are baby boomers moving in, taking advantage of the opportunities that were available at the time. They moved into California at that point in time to 2.5%, 2.8% for California. Because we have so many baby boomers, we also therefore end up with considerably more baby boomer deaths than many other states. So it's one of the reasons why, up until like 5-10 years ago, we were one of the youngest states in the nation. By the time we end up into 2030s, as time goes along, we're middling. We're about in, 26th, 27th youngest state in the nation. So, and that's because of the aging of that cohort. We can kind of see this with this. This is the current projection series and how it works out through here. You can see that your region is growing. It doesn't actually shrink, which is why I say you guys are actually not on a bad trajectory when it goes along, because if we look at what's actually happening in California, this black line that goes through here, the current projection series does have California shrinking little by little starting in the 2050s. And this is based on a fairly aggressive net migrant series in there. I have to tell you, this piece of the migration puzzle here between 2030 up to 2030 is probably going to be lower or less, to a certain extent, less buoyant than it is here, which will mean fewer populations in the future. But what's really driving this is the dark one down here, right? You can see the deaths march on, particularly accelerated through the 2040s into the 2050s and then leveling out. It's one of the things that your region actually is better at. It doesn't have quite that many deaths because it has a slightly younger population. You saw this from already a little bit, but I do point out the very important nature that to a certain extent net migration has on this. It is the component, particularly in the future, that keeps us with positive population growth. Could be migration from international migration, and it could be migration from other places in the United States. It is true that California should be as time goes on, and the rest. There are other parts in the United States that feel either climate change or some of the other things a little bit more, deeply, if you will. We still have we still have the Sierras. We still have we're relatively coastal in the climate. We should be a place where individuals should be able to migrate to and face weather conditions, climate conditions that are similar to what they are now. Maybe a little bit hotter, but not radically different than they are predicted to be in certain other areas in the United States. So, in that previous slide, it's migration that helps buoy us up. It's migration that shows into the various pieces that, keep the San Joaquin Valley going as it goes along with this one. So those huge growth rates that we saw previously are lower, but, in terms of slower growth, when it comes down to that, the projection that you saw there, right, that I was had 0.5, 0.4, you're thinking, wow, that's a lot less than the 3s that we had in the 80s or something like that. Yeah, but the current growth rate that you saw on that previous slide for California, at least for the next, about 20 years, is somewhere between 0.2 and 0.25. So you're growing, even with some of this aging issue and some of the declines in births. I think we still see the northern, so, you're still seeing your region proportionally growing at almost twice the rate of the state. And that's important to note. There are opportunities in that, and there's still a strong draw from the Bay Area and for various other things. Let's assume the high-speed rail. I don't even so much worry about high-speed rail at this point in time. I think the extension of ACE and a couple of the extensions of more commuter rails, a little bit more towards Sacramento or more towards, in terms of that, is actually going to have a broader and a more powerful perspective than a potential high-speed rail, since it's still potential. Migrants in general, and this is domestic migration. I mean, one of the issues for the California that certainly has been part of this is that we had this relatively comfortable piece in the 2010s that said that, well, we were losing individuals with less than a college education, and we were gaining people with a college education, and wasn't this wonderful? Well, because you can see over the last couple of years, I might ignore 2020 and 2021. Those are extreme pandemic years. But even after that, we still have some issues. And we did slightly before the pandemic as well, that we were losing individuals with a bachelor's degree or higher. It's not great because, in that sense, we're losing individuals that potentially we educated, and we're losing those to other states. I hope that this turns around. It's clearly going down, and Samjita will talk about some of the response, what that would be in effect if it were to continue. It's a little less of a problem in the northern, Central Valley and the San Joaquin area than it is in some other areas. I mean, a lot of this decline here is indeed individuals sort of in the Bay Area and parts of San Diego, Los Angeles, finding, opportunities for partial remote work in other states. One of my very last slides, though, but notice that this one is a precursor to one of Samjita's slides to a certain extent, but part of the reason we think, and it certainly is, and part of the reason why San Joaquin has had some of those growth issues during, San Joaquin Valley has had growth issues during the beginning of during the 2010s, is this argument that there is an affordability crisis, right? I mean, you see that, we know about this already. And that is part of the reason why even in really good sort of times in 2018, 2019, we lost a few individuals with bachelor's degrees and above, because it just became kind of difficult even for those individuals to forge a family. Many of them, but you do see positive benefits to your area there, because we have individuals from the Bay Area looking for cheaper housing, looking for a different type of housing, a different mix of housing. And I point this out that, obviously right here in the middle is, the Great Recession, and we have this sort of total collapse of housing construction in California. It's about 48,000. I'll let the scale off because it doesn't really work well with one of these graphs. Over the years, we've really recovered in terms of our multifamily growth. Multifamily is at about the level it was even during the, sort of the boom there as it goes along. It's not quite to the level it was during the early 80s, but it's still recovered fairly well in this. You can clearly see on the other side what the real issue is. We're nowhere close to the level of single family housing construction, at least statewide. And this does even apply a little bit to the northern San Joaquin Valley. As much growth as you have had, I realize you guys are looking at it going, what? We have, vast new cities, we have all kinds of stuff and, going on in this. Stanislaus has all of this, sort of general housing growth that's still lower than, it's lower than it needed to be. It's an important part of these numbers down here. But to accommodate, to solve the housing sort of affordability issue and et cetera, we really need numbers probably closer to these. And these were, single families around 100,000 a year rather than around 50,000 a year. That will set up some of Sangeeta's thing that goes along. I'll probably hop in a little bit later if she'll let me. But if you want to look more, obviously we have a website and et cetera, you can go there and feel what we're kind of doing about that. And so I will turn it over to Sangeeta with a slide that continues to talk really intently about the nature of immigration and how it really is an important driver for California.
Thanks, Walter, and thanks, Thomas. Good afternoon, everyone. So I kind of wanted to start now that both Thomas and Walter kind of set the stage about who's in California and who's in the North San Joaquin Valley area. California has historically kind of been dependent on immigration, particularly international migration, and a little bit less so from domestic migration. And especially in our H-1B visas that kind of drive the tech sector in the Bay Area, and which is such an important component of the highest earners in California generally tend to be in some of those information, professional business services sectors, and that therefore with our tax system kind of contribute to our general fund. So it's kind of important to take a look at how, who's in the H-1B visa and how that could be affected by any of those immigration and deportation policies from the federal administration. And then you can see on the next slide, the next picture, and the domestic in-migration, the domestic out-migration, we've historically kind of seen people moving into California from internationally, then they, live here for a year, get acclimated, and then they ended up moving out, just like, born citizens here. So it's kind of just like, we welcome them, and then we end up sending them to other parts of the United States. So that's just kind of been our history, looking at our how much of our population growth has been subject to the immigration. And then and that also, the reason we look at it so carefully is because that goes into our labor force and who's available to actually work in California's economy. And so that's why the population growth is such an important aspect of what we look at. Next slide. So this slide is actually looking at pre-benchmark data, just to let you know. The California Employment Development Department and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they benchmark data every year. So we kind of always have that balance between having data become immediately available and then benchmarking with later data that is a little bit more accurate. So we're always kind of trying to figure out timeliness and accuracy. And so we're going to update this a little bit and see if that's changed with the post-benchmark data. But before that benchmark data came out, if you look at the labor force participation rate, you could see that this also includes the updated population projections from Walter and his team. And our headline labor force participation rate has been in line with our historical average, what we saw, ignoring the COVID years. And we've actually kind of, our year to date is still slightly below where we were pre-COVID, the pre-pandemic average. And that's really driven by our senior workers, those who were above the age of 65. And every other age cohort actually has exceeded labor force participation rates from COVID. It's just that those at 65 and over. When COVID first hit, we saw some early retirements. We saw some people, obviously opting to kind of drop out of the workforce and, for public health concerns. And when that happens is we lose a lot of institutional knowledge at some businesses and corporations, and we also lose their potential contributions to our economy. And then also we're looking at if seniors retire earlier than they had originally planned, then they're looking at permanently lower levels of retirement benefits and retirement pay, whether it's pensions or Social Security. Therefore, they actually might need some more social services down the road than they might have otherwise needed because they kind of retired a little bit earlier than they had planned. So that's kind of where we are in terms of labor force participation rate. Next slide. This kind of really mirrors Walter's slides, which was just looking at total permits. And the reason we look at this, and obviously after the Great Recession and the housing bubble burst, we are averaging only about maybe 2,000 more units permitted a year than we were in the 90s when we were in that boom, the aerospace and defense sector boom era. But at the same time, we have 8 million more people in California. So although we have seen some population declines, we've seen some people leaving California, just in terms of who's in California, we're still not permitting enough units to allow people to live in California relatively affordably and pay a reasonable mortgage or a reasonable rent. And what happens is if you're paying a larger share of your income on shelter, whether it's rent or mortgages, you have less money to spend in the local economy, whether in goods and services. And then you also have less money to save eventually for a future home or for your retirement. So there's more issues than just looking strictly at housing affordability and how much you're paying for housing, because that has implications across the board for the economy. Next slide. So we generally kind of look at, we've kind of divided, there's all the sectors in California, there's 11 of them, and we kind of divided it broadly and what we consider, and this is just a finance definition of high wage, low wage relative to the 2022 average wage of about $88,000 a year. And so we just kind of looked at which sectors have an average wage that's above the California average wage and which sectors are below. And generally about 30% of our payroll jobs are in those considered high wage sectors, and 70% of those are considered in the low wage sector, meaning that their average pay is less than the state's average wage. And that has, again, some implications for their people's ability to afford to live in California, buy a home, send their kids to college, how much they're spending on local goods and services, and how much they're relying maybe on public social services and social safety nets. So that is an issue for us. Next slide. At the same time, the low wage sectors have been the ones that have been kind of driving the job growth in the last few years, especially our healthcare services. Again, that's just one of the consequences of our aging population. We need a lot of people to help take care of our elderly friends and neighbors and family. So we just see a lot of job growth in health services and social services. One of the challenges with that, however, is those jobs don't necessarily pay a lot, especially considering how expensive it is to live in California. High wage sectors have continued to kind of drag, and it's been a little bit slow in 2024 towards the end relative to where we were pre-pandemic. It's been actually losing jobs, and that's obviously the fewer people we have, like high wage earners, that has implications for our economic output, our tax revenue collection, and our general fund. So that's kind of important too. Next slide. So if we look at the North San Joaquin Valley region, as a share of California, you are just about 5% of our total population of the state. You're permitting, although there's some forward movement in terms of homes being permitted and the recognition that that's kind of an important thing. About 2.4% of new homes that have been permitted as of 2023. However, you're outkicking your coverage in terms of total personal income. It's about over 8% of California's total personal income, which is great. And then about 4% of total wage and salary jobs. And one of the dominant industries in the region is obviously agriculture, which is such an important component of our state's economy. Next slide. So the economic overview, some of the largest industries in the region are obviously agriculture, logistics, food processing, manufacturing, and emerging technologies. And we kind of think some of that growth is going to continue, especially in emerging technologies. Also some contributions from healthcare, again, as also your relative populations also aging along with the rest of California. And so we think that's going to, we're going to surpass like maybe about 700,000 jobs over the next 5 years in the region. Along with some of the infrastructure investments that you guys are that you're doing in terms of transportation corridors, especially to connect you to the Bay Area. And then as Walter had mentioned, the high-speed rail, if that comes through, and then some industrial park expansion to attract businesses and their employees. So the future kind of looks bright in terms of the economic output. Next slide. Oh, so we just talked about it, the key investments, you're kind of already thinking ahead, aging population, industrial development to attract businesses and workers, residential construction, really trying to focus on, possibly having more units permitted, more units authorized. One of the benefits of the region is that homes are comparatively more affordable than the rest of California, averaging about $300,000 less than an existing single-family home in the rest of the state's average. So, that's obviously a very attractive point especially for young families that are looking to establish themselves in a region. So, next slide. So the future is looking pretty bright, I think, as Walter had mentioned. There's obviously a geographical advantage to the area. I'm seeing some of the growth sectors of assembly, transportation, logistics, distribution centers, because of the area that you can include. Net migration is going to continue to be a positive for the region, especially for people who are looking to migrate out of the Bay Area and its high cost of living to a relatively more affordable region that's close enough. So that's an advantage, and so the developments and focuses that you're doing. So I think from our perspective, we're looking at sustained economic growth, solid job growth, and industry diversification. So you're kind of looking at, kind of protecting against future economic downturns. So that's all looking good for you. Next slide. If you're wanting to get like a snapshot of, the state's economic indicators and revenue indicators 10 times a year, except for when the budget is published, we release the finance bulletin. It's a 2-pager. The first page just has a snapshot of the economy, and then the second page is just a revenue update if you ever wanted to kind of take a look at where the state is. Next slide. And we are actually in the middle of working with the Department of Transportation on a long-run economic forecasts and demographic forecasts for each and every county in California. And so that's going to align along with our governor's budget and May revision economic forecasts, but provide a 30-year time horizon. And that's going to be hopefully available by the end of the year so that each county can look at their specific forecasts. Next slide. So obviously, there's a lot that's happening at the federal level that we haven't really touched on, but they are going to have, they've already started having some impacts for California and likely going to impact California moving forward. And so I just kind of want to touch a little bit on it because everything, obviously, none of us live in a vacuum. Things that are happening at the federal level are going to, and the national level, is going to impact the state and, of course, the North San Joaquin Valley. So next slide. So tariffs, I guess today is considered Liberation Day. So there's going to be an announcement probably just in the next few minutes about what that actually means. One of the issues with tariffs is how much that's been changing. The rates have been changing, the time period has been changing, the countries and the products that are affected are kind of been changing. And, so obviously uncertainty isn't good for markets. Uncertainty isn't good for business planning or consumer planning. So there's some issues in terms of how it's going to impact the economy, along with the impacts of tariffs, which can have an inflationary impact and an upward pressure on prices overall, but also in terms of the market uncertainty that's being introduced. And so this was kind of done a couple months ago, just looking at the tariffs that had been announced at the time of the inauguration, just generally looking at a 1.5% reduction in US GDP in 2025, and inflation was going to be increased by 0.4 percentage points. And that's just the initial tariffs. And if we looked at some really rough back of the envelope types of calculations, that could increase costs for California households by up to $3,000. Obviously, since then, we've seen a lot of new tariffs being implemented, retaliatory tariffs being implemented. So these costs are going to obviously change, but it just kind of looks like the tariffs are going to have a material impact on people's spending. Next slide. Immigration, there's been announced immigration policies. So far, we haven't seen any large-scale deportations happening. There's been some estimates of what that's, how many deportations are going to actually happen. Along with deportations is less and fewer legal immigration and more restrictive immigration policies that could impact like I said earlier about H-1B visas and other legal migration. And then also looking at, foreign investments in California, it could have, an environment that is not very welcoming to immigrants, may also have some ancillary impacts on international students coming to the US and California universities. It might have some impacts on foreign investment in California, and it obviously might have some impacts on leisure and hospitality and tourism, which is such an important sector for California's economy. Large-scale deportations will likely cause labor shortages, in fact, impact California's population growth, and then also cause some upward wage pressures that could also raise inflation. Next slide. The budget, if the 2017 tax cut gets extended, there's going to be some additional tax cuts for high wage and wealthy Americans. That actually might help mitigate some of the drags on GDP growth from the other proposals and administrative policies. However, the benefits from these tax cuts will likely be more pronounced for high earners and less so for middle income and low wage earners. Next slide. California is obviously, we touched upon some of the emerging technologies that the San Joaquin Valley is looking at. We can still kind of take a leadership role in looking at climate-related technology and policies. Since 2014, there's been a total investment in what's considered like green tech in California of over almost 10 billion, almost just over $9.3 billion. There's less investment on that. That's going to have some impacts on California, one of the key critical sectors for California's economy. Next slide. Education, we looked at the elimination of the Department of Education. Obviously, if that happens, if that stands and how that goes through, the state may have to step in and kind of have some increased supporting for some of the programs that were previously funded by the federal government. There's only so much the state can do to kind of fill in a stopgap measure for some of those federal and national programs. So that's going to kind of impact the state as well. And then next slide. Healthcare, if some of those Medicare or Medi-Cal gets cut, then we might also have to see some increased spending at the state level to cover some of those programs. Again, one of the key issues is exactly how much is getting cut, when it's getting cut, who's affected, and how much room the state has to kind of step in. California is the fifth largest economy in the world and the most dominant state in the nation. But even a state as well off as California, relatively speaking, only has so much room to kind of fill those gaps from the federal government. So that is something that we have to think about too. Next slide. There's obviously risks to California and the North San Joaquin Valley economy, escalations of geopolitical issues around the world. Like I said, we don't live in a vacuum. That's going to affect us. More extreme and frequent climate events that have been happening, and how do we mitigate those impacts? How do we protect ourselves? I didn't touch upon it, but some of the insurance companies pulling out of policies to insure homes and businesses. And that's going to affect location decisions both for businesses and location decisions for Californians if they can't afford or they can't get insurance on their homes. Our aging population cohort, if we have a larger share of our population that's over and above a retirement age, there's fewer people that are working age to support them. A lot of our resources need to go towards serving our aging population with social services, geriatric care, and things like that. And obviously the continued and critical housing shortage and high prices, those are like some of the immediate and long run risks to our forecast. Next slide. I wanted to also look at the fires that happened in the Los Angeles area in January. The state stepped in and provided $2.5 billion relief package. There's some other tax relief that happened in terms of deadlines, extending deadlines for taxes and streamlining, rebuilding and fast track housing, protection from price gouging and real estate speculators. The reason I wanted to touch upon that one is it's probably just in scale of destruction, about 12,000 homes across both Eaton and Palisades were estimated to have been destroyed and need to be rebuilt. Also, the sheer scale of it, it's considered some of the most expensive wildfire damages, climate damages in the United States history. And if we're looking at more of these events over the next few years as climate change becomes worse, we're going to really have to think about how we're allocating our money. As I said, the state, the $2.5 billion relief package. If we need to make sure that we're protecting and having these programs, if in the event, and hopefully it's unlikely event of other fires of that scale. So that's something to think about as well. Next slide. Revenue, risk to revenue. There's a lot of risks. California is a really progressive tax state where our highest earners pay a relatively higher share of our income taxes. So roughly about 49% of our state revenues comes from about 1% of our highest earners. So obviously that has an issue, how people behave, how they act in terms of paying their taxes, when they pay their taxes. I know I don't have to remind anybody that the tax deadline is coming up on April 15th. Exogenous factors, the stock market volatility. We saw some the stock market breaking records last year. There's been some course correction since then. Again, like I said, markets don't like uncertainty. Businesses don't like uncertainty. So stock market volatility kind of reflects a lot of that uncertainty that's happening. And an economic recession will obviously have a downward risk pressure on the revenues. And so there's some things to think about in terms of how that's going to affect the state's revenues and therefore the state's general fund and the programs that the state funds. Next slide. And that's it for Walter and me. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Samjita and Walter. Really appreciate that. And really appreciate the context that you gave us in the region. It's challenging, but at least our challenges are framed within opportunities in the state as a whole. And so good to hear. We have now, I know some people had to leave at 1 o'clock, but we have another half an hour for any questions or discussion that people might have. I don't know if there's anything in the chat. Rocky, I think you were keeping track of that. Are there any outstanding questions that are in the chat?
No questions as of right now.
So we gave lots to think about and mull over, but were there any questions from you all to us about what we've just reviewed? Left you speechless.
We've answered every possible question. Anybody?
Clearly.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So my name is Armando Valaria. I'm a trustee at Delta College, and I'm very interested in the information that was provided, and thank you very much for that. Because we're trying to project also into the future, and where do we need to provide services for our community from an education perspective. We just got a $600 million bond, and we're going to be expanding what we have at Mountain House, but my thought is always the Lathrop area as well, and Manteque area, because we're in Stockton and we're also talking about Lodi as well. You had mentioned education. That's the reason I'm asking the question about education, because it really wasn't elaborated on. So if you could kind of address that question, education moving forward from higher education, community college, and the universities, if you could.
I'll probably take that one since we did. Yes, I mean, to a certain extent, right. With a declining birth rate, even though the Northern San Joaquin Valley is kind of insulated from that a little bit, we still have declines. It is true that it's going to be a smidge challenging, but on the other hand, the community college in particular, more so than sort of, I mean, university has sort of a standard age range that goes through. Community college tends to be, and I talked to other community college districts and various other things about this, an expansion of what you think your typical students are. They're already a little bit broader. They'll probably be more broad in the future as well, partially because there will just be, I mean, ironically, this is peak 18 to 24 pop, right? I mean, every year after this one in California and also nationally, more or less, it might be peak national pop next year, but the total number of those 18 to 24 in that cohort will go down for at least the next 20 years, because obviously most of them are already born, unless we have larger amounts of immigration. So it's a really idea about getting out and thinking about not just trying to get individuals who are in that age range. It's going to be a little bit more about retraining and about extending sort of how, because it is true that as things move along, right, we don't get, and as particularly maybe as we think about some automation, there will be necessarily some job loss that go with that and some need to retrain and reskill. And it really depends on how that works, right? I don't think that those individuals need to go to a 4-year to do that. It really probably properly fits within a community college, and how that kind of work, the model that one wants to do this. I realize there are several different models for community college within California. I mean, there are ones thinking in Riverside that are a bit more technical, in the sense of its technical training. And then there are others that are a bit more sort of like 2 years pre-college type things. I think it's a question of what blend works for your own area and the individuals that you have there. I mean, I think it is notable though that you're not as bad as other places, right? I mean, this is a real issue in some of the Shasta County or some of the other ones where the population is probably not going, is going to decline. I mean, it's just going to go down, as opposed to in San Joaquin, Northern San Joaquin Valley, where population is expected to continue to grow, just not quite at the rate it had previously. And Mountain House is the example of that one, right? This is the first time we've had an incorporation, since Eastvale in 2011, or Curupa Valley. I don't remember which one was first, but it's notable that nowhere else in California there's been sufficient enough housing growth that it's now, worthwhile to consolidate that housing growth into a new city. Because we had, right, if you think about previously, a couple of new cities in the 2000s, we had, a dozen or so in the 90s, we had, 38 or so in the 80s. I mean, it's a sign that there is still, positive growth there. And so I think you're well poised there, at least when it comes to that you have to think about it, but you aren't quite in as dire straits as some other community college districts are.
In that context, I might just add, in the work with North Valley Thrive in particular, we're thinking about some of those changes though, and the evolution of adult education and workforce education. And as we think about some of these challenges of the social welfare system, will that mean that older adults are going to have to work longer? And how do we train them? Which hasn't historically been something that institutions like a private nonprofit like my own university has focused on. But does that mean an evolving model in terms of what we provide and what we do and how we partner with the community colleges and adult education providers in our region to address those needs, which seem likely to be, as Walter was saying, evolving as this population ages over time?
Thank you very much. Appreciate the comments.
And we do have a few questions in the chat. Dr. Pogue, I don't know if you want to look those over, if you'd like me to read those to you.
So in terms of the regional breakdown by ethnicity, I will talk to Eric and Yolanda, my taskmasters at North Valley Thrive, and I think we will be able to generate some regional estimates on that. I would encourage you to look, and I have in the slides references to the San Joaquin County population forecast that Isaiah mentioned on the SJCOG website. There's a draft link also to the StanCog website for their draft projections, and in that there are a bit more detail. Unfortunately, at least at the regional level, we don't have a lot of detail. We break it down. A lot is put into the other category. We do have African Americans, Hispanic, and white, but everybody else is put into a general other, which includes obviously a spectrum of Asians and other races and ethnicities. But that is broken down at a high level at a county perspective right now for San Joaquin and Stanislaus, which will be in the slides that we'll share with you. And yeah, I think we'll look at some of those details in terms of the region and some of the regional ethnic dynamics and racial changes that we're forecasting. And I'm going to hand it to you, Walter, in terms of that question about the shrinking college age, because I know you guys put out education forecasts as well.
Right. I mean, let's look at what we have in the region to a certain extent. I've talked to the UC demographers and the people doing their forecasts, and they feel that they can, of course, fill as many seats as they have. So they don't expect any change in their overall enrollment because it's a UC. CSU has some issues, I mean, in terms of filling those in the future, but those are a little bit further off to a certain extent because as it goes along. So the challenge is a little bit in the UC system when it comes down to that, but I don't necessarily know that reduced number of students, well, because the question you have to ask there is how much of the tuition is actually covering the cost of the college, and the answer to that one is that particularly at the community college level, tuition is a relatively small proportion of that. So I don't know that tuition will be really, should increase necessarily just because one has, what does usually happen, and we see that, is kind of going on right now, is that as enrollment declines, some hard decision will need to be made as to what programs are being offered in order to maintain a level of, viability. That's the harder decision. It's less about the tuition as it is more like, oh, well, if we're having an entire department for 5 students, maybe this is going to not be economically viable going into the future. So I would say with that, in terms of, I should talk about the, African American maternal health on that one. Yeah, I mean, the changes to Health and Human Services and the withdrawal of, or the presumed loss of some federal funds in there, I would hope the state would fill some of that need. I mean, obviously we don't have the ability to backfill 100% on that, but generally California has been better at that than many other states. The maternal health rates, while different and worse for certain race ethnic groups, are at least not as bad as they are elsewhere in the United States. So I would hope that we would continue. I would hope the state would have the funding and to a certain extent the desire to continue to try and work with those programs to make those go up, because that is a huge issue of that is a huge equity issue when it really comes right down to it.
I also really wanted to quickly touch on some of the federal funding cuts for research institutions that have already starting seeing some hiring freezes at like Stanford, Berkeley, et cetera. And these are also going to have an impact. How that's going to play out remains to be seen, but that is something in terms of, researchers, scientists, professors, maybe opting to leave there's always been some interest in moving to Canada. And so how that's going to play out in some of these universities remains to be seen. Probably the impact will be less at the community college level, but it is something I did want to kind of touch on that is going to have some implications as well.
Thanks. And I'll touch on this, and I don't know if you want to also mention anything, Walter, but in terms of the last cycle of the RENA forecast, that was for what we're working right now with SJCOG, that was a previous forecast. And again, we've seen at the CBPR over the years, as these declines have been faster than anticipated, we've seen slowing population growth in our subsequent forecasts. So as we've looked over time at our future population forecast, that has been the slope has been getting flatter and flatter over time of that trend. Saying that, I think it's important also that context that Walter provided in terms of the unmet needs of housing and that backlog, which is what RENA looks at as well. So it's not just the forecasted population, but that backlog in terms of unmet housing needs that needs to be addressed. And I just would frame that as a context for what we've been seeing here.
Yeah, I'll just, right. The next RENA cycle as it goes along should, it will use a new projection series that's kind of out now, but really one that we'll be releasing in September as an update with some of the recent migration trends things. So it'll actually probably have a little bit lower growth again. Commensurately, there'll be a new household projection series at the same particular point in time. That's of course the starting place for HCD in preparing arena. Then obviously consultation with the colleagues and various other things. It is that given the lower rates of growth that we project, the lower rates that lower rates of growth that are being projected here. The unmet need is going to be the big question, and that's HEDs. I can't really tell you what they're going to do with the unmet need component of arena, but at least the underlying pop projections, the underlying household projections, will in this next cycle reflect sort of these lowered growth expectations.
In terms of the slides, they will be posted, and for those of you that registered online, we will email them out to you. They'll be posted on the COG website as well as the North Valley Thrive website, I think by the end of today. So you can find them there if you don't get them emailed to you. Just take a look there, as well as a recording of this, because I'm sure you want to share it with all your friends and watch it tonight, rebroadcast live on your big screen back home. In terms of the comment about the data on ownership and rentals, that we do have some data on that, but that's another conversation which we're not getting into today in this webinar. And I see there's another question about permitting. Again, I think that's an important question. It's a little bit off of what we're focused on in terms of the question is about permitting incentives for manufacturers. I would just frame this in some of the work that we're doing in North Valley Thrive and its relationship to the state's California Jobs First initiative is to drive regional bottoms-up economic development strategies. And so what the governor is trying to initiate through California Jobs First and what has been happening with our work with North Valley Thrive is to really lay the foundation to where those kinds of initiatives about streamlined permitting, targeted industrial development can be focused on and address these needs to grow business opportunities. And again, feeding back to some of those slides that Walter and Sanjita were discussing, how do we make this region as competitive as possible, not only for the intra-California migration, but also for businesses across the country to come here and be attractive for our workforce and to create more good jobs and quality jobs, leveraging the endowments and capacity that we have in the region. Well, cool. I, again, am so grateful for Walter and Sanjita for joining us and for all you for logging on and coming today here. And thank you very much, as always, SJ Cog and North Valley Thrive for all your support in this work that we're doing.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.